Good afternoon. I hope the second week of classes has gone well for you. I'd like to, in just a moment, bring to a conclusion this first unit that we have discussed on prehistoric society, Stone Age society, as accessed or through some reflection about the Lascaux cave paintings. Let me just begin with a few announcements. On Monday, you will have a quiz. This will be an in-person quiz for the Monday group, and it will be an online quiz that the format of which I will announce soon for the Wednesday group and those not coming to class. I am also exceptionally going to be asking you to do a Flipgrid assignment. I had intended to do one for today, but I actually wanted the assignment to be about the material that we're covering today. So you'll be studying for the quiz in addition to doing this short Flipgrid video, and I think the two will go together. A reminder in the quiz, it will cover the idea of culture as well as the Stone Age culture, those two units. It will be factual questions, around 20. I am intending them to be multiple choice or possibly very short answers. They will be factual in character, and they will be sort of specific questions about the material that we have covered, focusing in particular on the readings that we've discussed in class and my lectures. And I strongly emphasize that lectures that were recorded, so for the days that you did not attend, are definitely included. So please do consider that. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. Something else I'd like to sort of put out there, and I think I'll send this out kind of as a questionnaire to the group, is whether or not you would like to have further engagement with this class by way of something like a synchronous Zoom meeting on Friday. And I would even be open to this being optional. So those who were interested could do it, and those who were not interested wouldn't have to. So it wouldn't necessarily substitute for the video lecture, but for those who are looking for more engagement, it would be a possibility. So keep that in mind. So today I'd like to turn to sort of the final and one of the most important parts of this unit, which is to reflect on theories of prehistoric art. Let me just remind you of what we've talked about so far. We talked about the discovery of the Lascaux cave paintings, and I sort of introduced you to the cave and its structure and its artwork. And then I also talked to you on Wednesday about the Lascaux people, what archaeological evidence has been able to find out about them, focusing in particular on the fact that they were anatomically modern human beings who were part of the Upper Paleolithic transition, and the fact that they belonged to the so-called Magdalenian culture that existed, I'm forgetting the exact dates, but from around 19,000 to 14,000 years ago in Western Europe. We also strongly emphasize the fact that the sort of economic system that these people followed was what's known as hunting and gathering. Today, what I'd like us to do is to sort of address the question of why did they paint the caves? That is my question. And so let me just sort of say a few things then by way of introduction to this question. First of all, this is a question that belongs to the field of prehistory. And I would just point out that if this doesn't sound like too odd a thing to say, prehistory has not always existed. And what I mean by that is, of course, after what we call prehistory occurred, it had still happened, but it was not known to have happened by later generations of human beings. And it was really not until the 19th century in Europe, in other words, roughly the 1800s, that contemporary human beings became aware of their prehistoric past. An important moment in the recognition that humans had a very long and deep history that came well before recorded history, was the discovery in 1879 of cave paintings located at Altamira in northern Spain. You're seeing an example of those cave paintings, which were discovered in 1879. And even though this is not the Magdalenian culture, I believe it came shortly before, and it's believed to to have some connections to Lascaux, which is not terribly far away. It's on the other side of the mountains that separate Spain from France. But this was an important moment in the development of the scholarly field of prehistory. In other words, a recognition that there were traces from a very distant and ancient human past that had to be decoded in their own distinct way. And so, to return to my obsession with this term hermeneutic, I think we have to once again ponder the hermeneutic challenges that the study of prehistory poses. And again, what I really mean, what I always mean when I say hermeneutic, is interpretive. That there certainly are factual. There is certainly factual information that we can learn about these people, having to do with, I don't know, the composition of the paint that they used, the depths of the caves in which they painted. But those don't answer some of the questions that we might reasonably want to ask, such as, what do the paintings mean? And that is an interpretive question, a hermeneutic question. And as I've said on several occasions now, the best way to understand that is or to rephrase that question is, how do we decode these paintings? The paintings can be thought of as a kind of code, in the sense that they embodied or meaning for the people who painted them, and we have to go through the reverse process. We have to the painters started with the meaning, if you will, and encoded it into the painting. We have to go through the reverse process of starting with the painting and seeing if we can decode it. And that is, of course, the question that the hermeneutic circle seeks to answer. I'd ask you to consider these questions as they relate to the readings that I had you do this week. Why, according to Clot, do we need to understand the meaning of prehistoric art, not just the scientific facts? I would suggest to you that one way to sort of think about this is precisely in terms of what I'm calling the hermeneutic circle. In other words, only by asking about meaning can we decode or try to decode the paintings. Another question to think about is what assumptions early scholars brought to the study of prehistoric art. As I've said on several occasions, the hermeneutic circle, or one version of the hermeneutic circle, emphasizes the fact that we understand the strange in terms of the familiar. If we think of prehistoric art as something strange, in the sense that it is not a set of meanings that comes from our own world, we have to try and relate it to things that we know, that we are familiar with, or rather, it's almost our sort of spontaneous instinct to do so. And I think that what you'll see as I present in just a moment the theories of prehistoric art, that you'll see that, in a sense, we can sort of see the hermeneutic circle in action, if that doesn't sound too odd a thing to say, in the sense that what we will see is a kind of back and forth process by which the first scholars precisely tried to think of the Lascaux art and other prehistoric art in terms that were familiar to them. But they increasingly realized that they had to revise those assumptions in light of what they were learning about the caves themselves, among other things. So again, this slide right here is what I just said. First scholars explained cave art in terms of what is familiar. And one way to sort of check that quite natural tendency, I'm not wagging my finger, as it were, at those who explain things that are strange in terms of what is familiar, because I'm not really sure exactly what the alternative would be. This is a sort of natural tendency of the human mind, I would suggest. The issue is, or the interesting part is, what the next step is. And one way that you might think about what the next step is, of sort of broadening out from the making sense of the strange in terms of the familiar, is by thinking about context, which is another way of just saying the whole. But what I mean in this context, or in this situation, is something like the historical context. How can we place or situate these paintings that we're looking at in terms of a much broader society of which they were a part? If you were simply just to find this object as a historical artifact 10,000 years from now, you might evaluate it in terms of all kinds of ways. You might, talk about the materials that it's composed of, look at its shape, and so on. But you would need to understand something about for want of a better term, the role of paper and how it connects to bureaucracy and office work and things like that, to have a complete understanding of it. That's what I mean by understanding the context. You can talk about the properties of the object, but only by connecting them to the broader context can you have a fuller understanding of what the object is intended for or means in some ways. So that's what we're going to try and do with the painting. So that's a long introduction. Let's actually start looking then at 4 main theories of prehistoric art. The first theory is called the art for art's sake theory. What do I mean by that? Art for art's sake simply means that art requires no justification. That art is not an activity about which we have to ask the question, why was it done? It's enough to say it's done because people wanted to make art. The pursuit of artistic activity explains itself. So, and I think that this made sense in many ways to Europeans living in, say, the 1800s, because that was a common justification in their own society. There was a recognition, as you can see if you visit the great art museums of places like Paris or London or Vienna or elsewhere, that art was an inherently valid activity. But not all societies, of course, may have understood art in quite those terms. Scholars who, and so what I'm saying is that one interpretation of the cave paintings was to see them as an expression of art for art's sake, or the inherent worth or value of art. These scholars in particular saw the cave paintings as proof that human beings have what Europeans in the 1800s called an aesthetic sensibility, i.e. that we all have kind of an artistic sense, that beauty resonates with us. When we see a pretty picture, when we see a sunset, when we hear a favorite song that moves us, that's simply what's meant by an aesthetic sensibility, a kind of artistic nature. And the argument is simply that the prehistoric people who painted the caves also had an artistic nature. There's a couple of other assumptions that are part of this, and I apologize that my phone is ringing right now. In fact, I'm going to briefly stop just so that sorry about that. So there's a couple of other assumptions that go with this theory, which is that if you have people in a society that are engaged in artistic activity for its own sake, they must have a certain amount of time on their hands. Now, we could flesh that out a little bit more and talk about sort of the economic assumptions on which it rests, but I'll just keep it simple for now. People who can engage in art as an inherent activity are not people whose primary concerns is surviving. So there's an assumption that this took the form in prehistoric societies of something like free time. So without exaggerating too much, you could say that the art for art's sake theory is tied to an assumption that prehistoric peoples had leisure time. There are some problems, though, I would suggest with this theory, and I'm always going to sort of talk about the pros and cons, if you will, of the theories. First, it became increasingly apparent to people who actually studied the archaeological remains of Stone Age societies that these people did in fact live in difficult circumstances, that they spent the vast majority of their time trying to survive, through hunting, gathering, traveling as nomads, finding shelter, and so on. So the notion that somehow there's these kind of free-living cavemen who had time on their hands to paint doesn't seem particularly plausible. There's also the notion that in many societies prior to Europe in the 1800s, art was not just individual. It wasn't just something that was an expression of one person's talent or genius, but it was a social activity, something that expressed the society and that people even did in groups. Whereas the art for art's sake theory tends to sort of emphasize individual great artists. And I think the sort of core problem, and this is one that has a lot to do with the hermeneutic circle, is that it assumes that prehistoric art is the same as modern European art. If you look at the picture that I have on my slide of someone at a museum looking at paintings, that's a kind of recognizable activity perhaps to you, but it is an activity associated with a particular type of society, a sort of modern, probably capitalist society. This is not the society of the Stone Age, so the sort of core problem with this theory is that it sort of goes too far in assuming that Stone Age art is the same as contemporary European art. This leads us to the next theory, which builds on, and you might say improves upon, the first theory, excuse me. This is the theory known as cave painting as sympathetic magic. And this theory sort of makes an interesting move. And by the way, I haven't been extremely clear with this, but the other theory was sort of in the late 1800s, and this one comes shortly after it. And I would say that the key shift or the key change that this theory brings to the previous one is that it understands the art not simply just as art for its own sake, not simply as, to use a fancy term, representational art, to use a less fancy term, as pretty pictures that just exist because they're pretty. This theory understands painting as part of an activity. Okay, so that you, in a sense, can really only understand the brushstrokes and images on the walls of Lascaux if you kind of creatively recreate in your mind the activity that they are connected to. The former theory would be sort of like talking about a baseball bat as a kind of admirable work of sculpture or craft work without understanding that it is part of a game, and that you can't fully understand the object without connecting it to the activity that it was designed to be a part of. So this cave painting, or this theory rather, sees art as an expression of a kind of magical activity which was assumed to be important to the lifestyle of Stone Age peoples. A French scholar, a monk named Abbot Henry Breuil, argues that prehistoric images are magical. How did he arrive at this conclusion? I would argue that there's still the hermeneutic circle at play here, but he's kind of broadened his sense of what you might consider to be the familiar. Breuil had studied evidence from hunting and gathering societies that still existed in the world in the late 1800s and early 1900s. For instance, in parts of Southeast Asia, the islands around Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and so on. Evidence in those societies, hunting and gathering societies still existed, and it became clear to scholars, i.e., early anthropologists who studied these societies, that images were believed to be able to control or have an impact on animals upon which these people were dependent, and in particular on controlling the reproduction of animals. In other words, to put this extremely simply, it's a little bit like sort of common assumptions about so-called voodoo, i.e. that the image has some deep connection to the thing itself. And let me just sort of comment for a moment on the term sympathetic. What makes magic sympathetic? Sympathetic is a term, it can just be a complicated way of saying nice, but sympathetic means, in particular, in this instance, the sharing of feeling. Sympathetic is a Greek word. Pathos is a Greek word for emotion or feeling. Sym means sharing. So it means sort of the sharing of feeling. And so what sympathetic magic meant in this case was magic that was based on the premise that there was some kind of deep emotional or spiritual connection between the image of the thing and the thing itself. There's a connection between the image of the horse and the actual horse. So Breuil in particular believed that Lascaux images were designed to influence hunting. They were part of a major social activity. We don't necessarily know how they were intended to have such an effect, but his argument is that they were painted for the purpose of having an impact on the major economic concern, if you will, of these people, which was hunting large herd animals. It's also connected to ideas about what early anthropologists began to call totemism. This is sort of a different take on this theory. What is totemism? Totemism is the notion that a particular group of people, like say a hunting and gathering sort of nomadic group, has a special kind of spiritual connection to a particular animal, to a spirit animal, if you will. So a sort of further fleshing out of this interpretation suggests that some of the animals might be a way of representing a particular group as well. And again, this theory is based on the idea that in late 19th and early 20th century Europe, evidence had been found of early quote unquote primitive societies that did in fact practice totemism, so it was kind of projected back onto the Stone Age people. But this theory also has problems. Some people say that the theory is a little bit too elastic. To put it differently, a theory that can explain everything doesn't really explain anything. Art was said to influence so many different things that the utility of the theory kind of dwindled, receded. Art was said to influence hunting, but also fertility and fighting off bad animals. So it's a little bit too flexible a theory. It tries to explain too much and thus can't make a sort of a direct connection between anything. One major shortcoming was this, and I think this is a perfect example, again, of the hermeneutic circle. Archaeologists who were studying not so much art, but things like kitchen midden, which again is sort of the term for prehistoric trash at things like campsites, began to study the remains, and as they analyzed them, they were able to make pretty reasonable assumptions about what the diet of these prehistoric people were. And they found out that the animals that they ate were not the same as the animals they painted. Okay, so this is a sort of significant obstacle to this theory, suggesting that that it can't really, that the painting cannot really have been about hunting, because the animals that they portrayed were not those that they had for dinner. The theory also doesn't account for various aspects of the painting, such as human figures, symbols, and the location of the caves. It just doesn't have anything to say about those features of the cave paintings, and that seems to be a shortcoming. It doesn't explain enough in that sense. This leads us to the third theory, and I'll sort of say up front that there are aspects of this that are a little bit tricky, so bear with me. This is a theory that's associated with another French archaeologist whose name is Louis-Gourhan, who you can see, whose name is written down on the slide. And I'll just sort of say a few things, sort of summarize this sort of first point. And I guess I would point out that something else that's interesting about these theories is that they all kind of start by emphasizing different aspects of the cave paintings, and for Louis-Gourhan, this was a sort of importance. The following is an important starting point. He basically became interested in the location of paintings in caves relative to their age. Those paintings for which evidence exists that they were put together 30,000 years ago show us symbols and some art inscribed near the entrances of caves. Cave paintings and cave inscriptions from about 5,000 years later show that the artists had gone deeper into the caves, but still into places where daylight could be found. 5,000 years further, and this would be about 20,000 years ago, which is roughly the Lascaux period, we have caves that are perpetually dark. Okay, and then if you go even 6,000 years later, there are some instances of caves of painting that is so deep inside caves that it was basically a trip to get there. Lascaux is completely dark, is completely impervious to daylight, but it's a couple minutes, it's a minute or two below the surface. These caves were trips, that might even take a day or so to in total darkness to arrive at. And then eventually art began to return to the cave entrances. So what's the significance of this? In other words, Louis-Gourhan argues that the depth of art and the tendency, it seems, of art to become deeper in the cave over time matters. What's up with that? In a nutshell, and I think we discussed this in class with one of the groups, is this. Louis-Gourhan argues location matters, and in a sense, if Breuil's theory was based on the idea that archaeologists had not connected painting to activity, Louis-Gourhan's perspective is that archaeologists had not connected painting to the space. We need to understand the space, and very, very simply, he argues that these spaces are sacred. A really simplistic way of saying that is that these are primitive churches. That's simplistic, but it's something like that. They are sacred spaces, and the reason why we know that is because they seem to be deliberately separated from what you might call secular spaces, again using modern terms, i.e. spaces where the Stone Age people conducted their daily lives. So it seems like that there is a sort of conscious effort to say There are spaces where you carve up and skin animals that you've hunted. There are spaces where you prepare meals. There are spaces where you feed children. Those are the spaces of ordinary daily life. Then there is the separate, distinct realm, which is the sacred. And early anthropologists at this time were essentially defined sacred as a kind of necessary sort of binary term, meaning a term that always is contingent on its relationship to another term, namely the secular. So sacred is the most basic definition of sacred is separation from ordinary daily life. Something that the sacred means something that is simply not part of ordinary daily life, and the depths of the cave thus suggests their sacredness, according to this theory. And the sort of next step of Leroi-Gourhan's theory was after he had sort of interpreted them as sacred spaces. That's the first part of his theory. His argument was that you have to sort of connect the paintings to each other, that you can't sort of treat them as separate, discrete artworks. You have to sort of assume that they are all connected. He actually participated in a movement of thought at this time called structuralism, which basically holds that the human mind always operates according to structures. That the human mind never just has bits and pieces of knowledge, but that those bits and pieces of knowledge are always tied to kind of broader assumptions about how everything fits together. I'll try and explain that more in just a moment. So his question was, how are the paintings situated in relation to other paintings? Without going into great depths about his quite elaborate theory, he became interested in sort of the relative location of paintings in relationship to the cave, how they relate to the cave surfaces, and how they relate to each other. By the way, this picture of, I believe the bull that you see here is an example of a Lascaux painting where the sort of shape of the animal is deliberately takes advantage in its representation of bulges in the cave wall. It's almost as if the artist decided to paint the bull there because it had the sort of bulges. The wall had the bulges that would facilitate and enhance the representation of the bull. So what Leroi-Gourhan ultimately comes up with is a sort of decoding of the cave's codes, and I think he is very sort of clear and maybe very explicit about sort of thinking about the paintings as a code. The term that he uses is the caves consist of a symbolic system. So consequently, the way that you might describe this is that Leroi-Gourhan is saying something like the cave paintings are a kind of primitive language, and a key part of this primitive language, he maintains, is a key part of this language is the sort of ordered opposites or contradictions, to use a grammatical term, antonyms upon which it depends. There are many paintings that he thinks are about the distinction between nature and culture, and a crucial distinction that he sees in the cave paintings is the distinction between male and female. He also sort of makes the further assumption, and I'll leave it to your imagination to think about why he said this, that the caves were symbolically feminine. It has to do with sort of the notion of depth. And so the picture here is actually from Leroi-Gourhan's book, and what he has done, and we have not talked a lot about this, but it seems that in addition to the actual paintings, there are these kind of sort of abstract symbolic figures that are frequently found in the cave walls, and Lois-Guéron interprets them as references to sort of to symbols for gender, male and female in particular. And if you really wanted to be slightly kind of crude about this, you could say that there is that one sees in the cave paintings something that is not that different from from the kind of sort of rough and crude and vulgar drawings that one might find in certain restrooms. That's an exaggeration, but not too much. Again, sort of these excerpts from Lois-Guéron's book sort of further kind of show that the way that he sort of tried to, what all these pictures are him sort of taking the pictures or the images from various cave walls, including Lascaux, and trying to sort of decode them as a kind of consistent and regular set of symbols. And without going sort of greatly into his theory, and I would say that the sort of main idea of Lois-Guéron's notion of the cave as a symbolic system is that what we are witnessing in these paintings is a kind of vast reflection on the part of Stone Age people on sort of the nature of the world in which they lived in which, even if we don't know exactly what their views were, they saw the relationship between men and women, or male and female elements, as crucial. And if you think about the fact that they would have to be very concerned with social relations, but also with reproduction, their own reproduction, as well as the reproduction and fertility of the herds that they hunted, it makes sense that they might sort of interpret everything in their world in terms of male or female gendered activity, and the various ways in which those elements might relate to one another. That's the sort of basic theory. So what are the problems with this theory? I mean, it's a very, very brilliant and sort of ingenious theory in the way that it tries to decode the caves as a kind of almost sort of primitive language or mythology. The problem is, as can happen often with things, with theories that seem extremely brilliant, is that when you actually sort of examine it up close, it appears very subjective and arbitrary. Like, how exactly does Lois-Guéron know for sure that these signs mean what he says? It also sort of takes for granted that symbolic systems never change. This is a problem. If you think about music, even if you think about something like language, it's clear that those evolve over time, whereas an assumption of Lois-Guéron is that doesn't happen for these symbols. And a further sort of criticism is, if these symbols don't change, why did they paint them? What is the actual motive? Like, fair enough, let's take it for granted that Stone Age people may have thought in these terms. Why do you need to put them on the walls? What's the actual reason for painting them? This is, maybe you could say, kind of, in a sense, a return of the two previous theories, which, for all their limitations, do at least have an explanation of why the painting occurred. Lois-Guéron has a brilliant decoding of the symbolic system, but he does not actually tell us the motivation for painting. So this brings us to the final theory, and I am going to try and make sure that I wrap up in 50 minutes, but I will need at least 10 minutes to talk about this one. I call this one, this is a name that I've attempted to give it because it simply has sort of different parts. This is one that you actually read about today, looking at Lewis Williams. video and the article that he wrote with Jean Clout. A few things about this one. It draws on evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is a field that basically argues that the human mind, and not just the mind, but the human brain, evolves according to the same mechanisms as all natural processes in nature evolve. In particular through the sort of natural selection of traits that are particularly well suited to the environment. The sort of basic assumption is that by the time that we get to the so-called Upper Paleolithic transition and anatomically modern human beings, we have an animal, i.e. us, that is endowed with a different kind of brain. And this matters. The brain is able to control the environment in ways that earlier brains were not. This can result in things like the tools that we talked about, and tools that can be made with the kind of qualities that we discussed, such as foresight, abstract thought, and so on. But here in a nutshell is the theory of the brain that this theory draws upon, and I'll try and explain it sort of very simply. It's a theory that is associated with an evolutionary psychologist named Stephen Mithin. And it argues that once upon a time, before the Upper Paleolithic transition, before anatomically modern human beings, we have a brain that is what he calls modular, that consists of separate functions. There's a function in the brain that deals with interacting with other people. There's a function of the brain that deals with natural history, i.e. an understanding of the natural environment. There's one that is technical, that has to do with an understanding of how the body can be used to manipulate and shape the environment. There's a linguistic form of intelligence which has to do, it's maybe the properly cultural one, that has to do with how we can make sounds and engage in symbolic activity that is understandable with others. And then there's a kind of general intelligence, which I call sort of the operating system. And the way that I would sort of suggest to this is that, let me explain the whole thing and then I'll sort of come back. The argument is that in the Upper Paleolithic transition, what happens is these different and distinct mental or cognitive functions become sort of connected and integrated. They don't just operate independently, they can interact with each other. The way that I would sort of compare this is think about sort of technological innovation, changes in our own time. If you think about the fact that, once upon a time, maybe 25 years ago, you might have had a calculator, a telephone, i.e. a landline, because that's the only kind that there was, a calendar or agenda, and let's see, a pocket radio that you use to sort of carry your music around with you, or once upon a time there was a thing called a Walkman, but I won't get into that. And then what's happened in recent years, the cell phone came about, and the cell phone could not only carry out all those activities in a single object, but it could sort of integrate them, and I'll let you sort of figure that out. You can, you can share your music with other people or something like that. The different functions are connected. The argument is that something similar happens with the brain, that once upon a time the brain had these separate functions, but they didn't speak to each other. They were not part of the same system. But with the Upper Paleolithic transition, they do. Why does this matter? I guess at a basic level, this is a cognitive argument for things like how symbolism becomes possible. there are new cognitive processes that can occur. It means that we can make visual images with our technical ability to manipulate the environment, but that we can connect them, say, to things like language, or connect them things to our understanding of society. In other words, once these different cognitive processes start to speak to each other, as it were, symbolism becomes possible. It becomes possible for one thing to be seen as like or as representing something else. So the very sort of idea that we can attribute meaning to something is, in a sense, connected to this cognitive shift. Now, there's a sort of another aspect to this theory, which I'll spend a little bit of time talking about, that's associated with this, I believe, South African archaeologist named David Lewis Williams. And basically, his argument is that there is another distinct feature of the anatomically modern human brain, which has, you might say, the character of consciousness, which is that any brain that has consciousness can also have altered states of consciousness. Lewis Williams, I don't know if he intends this as a joke, but I do think it's kind of funny, says that consciousness and altered states of consciousness are a package deal. One comes with each other, with another. What does he mean by altered states of consciousness? It's the different way of experiencing the world that comes when we hyperventilate, are exhausted, face extreme hunger, or sensory deprivation. I hope this is obvious, but it is worth saying. You know, it's the kind of things that one feels or experiences when one's intoxicated. You may have heard of intoxication, and the state of mind we're in that situation is one of altered states, altered states of consciousness. And Lewis Williams argues that it is very, very important that a modern brain can also experience intoxication, if you will. That's a summary of his view, but it's fairly accurate. And the reason why he thinks this is important is because it means that sort of new experiences can happen to the brain that could not have happened previously. I hope this doesn't freak anybody out, this next slide. But Lewis Williams argues that one of the earliest forms of religious belief becomes possible at this time because of the experience of altered states of consciousness, and this is what's called shamanism. Shamanism is a belief that the human brain, or that human beings can get in touch with spirits that are part of the world, but that are not part of the ordinary world. And that the whole sort of idea is that to access these spirits, one has to cross a kind of portal from the ordinary world to the spirit world. Some scholars of shamanism describe it as a vortex, hence my slide. Lewis Williams makes the hard argument that the cave is the vortex, that the shamanistic belief that there is a kind of ordinary world, and then a spirit world, and then a vortex through which one must cross to get to the spirit world, maps perfectly onto caves and provides an important explanation of cave art. What the shaman really is the person who can mediate between the worlds. And in a nutshell, he argues that shamanistic beliefs are the explanation of cave paintings. Here's how it works. He argues that the walls were conceived by early humans as sort of membranes to other worlds. As in other words, walls that still can sort of regulate what goes through them and what doesn't. And that the purpose of human beings is kind of to coax the animal spirits out of these distant worlds through the membranes. So Lewis Williams not only emphasizes the caves and the paintings, but the walls themselves, which are seen as kind of this access point to the spirit world. He also argues that the paintings are essentially kind of visions or hallucinations that these early humans have when they're deep in these dark caves, but that they have decided to kind of fix permanently with paint. This horse's head that's on a different cave and a place called Rouffignac seems to suggest this. Lewis Williams sees this as a kind of hallucination that has been made tangible. This is Lascaux in this place called the Meander. It's the so-called and the Meander's at the very end of the axial gallery. It's the point where after the axial gallery you can't go any further, and there's this kind of falling horse, and sort of the Lewis Williams theory sort of suggests that this is a kind of shamanistic hallucination or vision that was then sort of fixed through paint onto the wall as they were kind of trying to sort of coax it out. It's also interesting that there is no position in the cave from which this entire painting can be seen at once. To see the whole thing, you have to move around, which may be interesting for this theory as well. Certain paintings only became clear thanks to shadows. This is also sort of an aspect of this theory. And the slightly kind of surreal element of some cave paintings is explained by this theory as well. This is a famous one from a cave called Trois Frères. It is, where it shows a human-animal hybrid. It looks like it's sort of a combination of a deer and a human being. And, the argument is that not only are these hallucinations, but that there is a kind of understanding that what the figure of the shaman actually is someone who mediates between the human world and the animal spirit world. In other words, a type of person who is capable of being both in the ordinary human world and in the spirit world. And that it was perhaps these people who were involved in the sort of activities that resulted in the painting of the caves. This, by the way, gives you a sense that the picture that I've shown you here is on the left is a reproduction of the one that's actually in the cave. On the right is what it actually looks like. And something that I'm sorry, to go back. Something I should say about this one is, and I don't know that I've actually said it yet, but that is important. Lewis Williams' idea is that what happens is people go into these caves. Perhaps they have danced intensely before going into it. Perhaps they have subjected themselves to deprivation of food and other forms of nourishment. And that once they go deep into these extremely dark caves, they are in a state, no sensory deprivation plus perhaps other forms of deprivation that makes them very, very exposed to altered states of consciousness, put simply very, very prone to hallucination. And that what's going on in these caves is kind of a self-conscious attempt to put oneself in a state of hallucination so that one is disposed to be able to contact the spirits sort of on the other sides of the walls, as it were. Another sort of interesting feature of this theory is that it explains the abstract geometric shapes that one finds in the paintings that look kind of like almost sort of random doodling or graffiti. If you look at this painting, you've got the picture of this is from the Axial Gallery at Lascaux. You've got a painting of a deer of a certain kind, of an antlered animal, and then at the bottom you have these little spots, these black spots, of which I'm not sure. It looks like there's about 12 or so. what's up with these spots? What is, why did the artist bother putting those in there? And Lewis Williams' argument is that they are so-called entopic phenomena, entoptic phenomenon. These are sort of images that the mind sees in mental conditions. I have never experienced these myself, but I know that some people who experience migraine headaches experience entoptic phenomenon. People talk about sort of seeing stars, and there can be a sort of real tendency to have to experience entoptic phenomenon when one is in a state of extreme sensory deprivation or altered states of consciousness. So, what is Lewis Williams saying? That when these people are in the kind of hallucinatory state in the caves, they will see these in their eyes. They will see these kind of entoptic phenomenon that really are their minds kind of playing tricks on them, if you will, and that they also sort of imprinted these entoptic phenomena that they were seeing in these altered states on the cave's walls. These are the entoptic phenomenon that Lewis Williams has sort of culled together from a lot of cave art. So to sum up, the main idea of this theory is that human consciousness, of the theory of human consciousness and ecstatic states, is that cave art is shamanistic, but that shamanism kind of makes sense of a universal characteristic of the human mind, which is paradoxically our ability under certain mental conditions of having hallucinations and similar phenomenon when we are in an altered state of consciousness. Shamanism is the way that we make sense of the mind's tendency to sort of see things that are not there, if you will. So I will conclude my lecture here. What I have tried to suggest to you or present to you, and that you've also read about in some of the assignments for this class this week, is 4 theories that seek to explain cave painting. They are all interpretations of cave painting. I have presented them in the order in which they were developed. I would not necessarily assume that means that those theories are, or rather that I would not assume that because I presented them in that fashion that the later the theory, the more accurate it is. I think all of them merit consideration. I think all of them have pros and cons. Very simply, what I'm going to ask you to do for your Flipgrid assignment, which I will get out to you shortly, is to talk about which theory you think is more convincing, and to focus on a particular image from Lascaux that you think is validated by that theory. I'm going to end here. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have via email or other ways. Think about the issue of whether you'd like to have a Zoom meeting, and remember you have a 20-question quiz on Stone Age culture and the idea of culture on Monday. Thanks, everyone. I know I've gone a little bit over time. I'll try not to do that in the future. I look forward to seeing all of you next week, or most of you next week on Monday and Wednesday. Stay safe, and talk to you soon.